truth will set you free. The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free. The truth will set you free.
Hello, and welcome to the Tech Dirt Podcast. I'm Mike Masnick. Once again, I wanted to thank everyone for their recent feedback, and especially to those of you who have been sharing this podcast with others. We've noticed a nice uptick in the number of listeners over the past few weeks, as well as seeing more of you sharing links to and praise for the podcast on places like Facebook and Twitter. That's great. Please keep it up and do more of it. For many years, one of the things that we've noted on Tech Dirt is that anytime a particular issue becomes partisan in any way, it seems to get stupid. You suddenly lose all ability for rational debate, and it suddenly becomes an issue of blue team versus red team, and a whole lot of garbage thrown in. Any logical or rational discussion gets tossed out completely. It's just not possible because it immediately gets twisted and distorted. So it's always interesting when big ideas come along that haven't yet gone through the partisan ringer. And one that caught my attention recently is the idea of a basic income guarantee, or BIG. The idea is almost exactly what it sounds like. Countries would guarantee a certain basic level of income, which everyone gets automatically, no questions asked. It's not means tested, and it's not welfare. This level of income should allow people to meet all basic needs that we would expect to be met today. Things like reasonable food, decent housing, access to transportation, and communications. You could, of course, earn much more than that through work, or if you found the big to be enough, you could focus on what economists have traditionally called leisure, activities that don't earn you any further income. While at first pass, this idea may seem like some form of socialism, and some have certainly called it that, the deeper you dig into the idea, the more you realize it's something different altogether. In fact, a growing number of libertarian and free market capitalism supporters have been jumping on the basic income guarantee bandwagon. And there's a third variable in all of this, which has drawn renewed interest in the concept of basic income guarantee, and that's the rise of automation. Since the beginning of the industrial age, people have certainly worried and fretted about the rise of automation and how it would lead to fewer and fewer jobs and unemployed mobs of angry people. Historically, many of these predictions have turned out not to just be wrong, but laughably so. Industrialization tended to create many new jobs in new and different areas that might not have existed long before that. However, these days, some think that this time is different, as the automation is now concerning computer intelligence, and it's difficult to see where those new jobs may come from in that case. The idea of a basic income guarantee may certainly help to alleviate the expected disruption that would come from many fewer workers needed in the future. Of course, there are still a ton of questions around how this would actually work in practice, as well as what the consequences would be. Where would the funding come from? Would it create disincentive to work where such work is needed? Would it create other unintended consequences? Just recently, Albert Wenger, a partner at the venture capital firm Union Square Ventures, gave a TEDx talk in which he discussed this idea and why he thinks it's a big and important idea that is at least worth testing out. The timing of this was perfect since my co-host Dennis Yang and I have been having an ongoing discussion about this idea as well. Given that, we invited Albert to join us here today in the studio to continue our discussion on mic. Welcome to both of you. And let me start out by asking Albert the first question, which is, how do you think a basic income guarantee should work?
Well, Mike, just the way you described it, which is a certain amount of money that is paid to anybody, independent of their gender, independent of their employment status, and maybe some age, maybe it's 15, maybe it's 16, and that's not means tested. It's the idea of essentially decoupling the base level of what anybody might need from work. And as you hinted at in your discussion, the reason why that's very much an important question today is because we don't exactly know what the future of work looks like.
How do you think it would make sense to fund that kind of thing? I know there are a couple different ideas that have been suggested. Have you thought through?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is important to really get right is what the amount should be. And there's a fairly big discrepancy between different people who propose this idea as to how big the amount needs to be. I'm sort of in the camp that it doesn't need to be very large because I believe we live in a deflationary world that's deflationary because of technology. Lots and lots of things are getting cheaper. If you look at the US, for instance, since the mid-1990s, consumer durables have already been getting cheaper on a quality-adjusted basis. The things that have been getting more expensive are healthcare and education. Those are two areas where I'm a big believer that we are figuring out how to use technology to make those cheaper also. Right. So once you get to sort of lower amounts that are not in the many thousands or multiple thousands a month, it actually gets quite easy. We have the existing household sizes of the state and federal households to afford this. I do, however, also believe that you would want to cut existing means-tested programs. So I don't think you need a basic income guarantee and a food stamp program, for instance.
Right.
Do you, I mean, one of the concerns certainly about this is that if you have a basic income guarantee, that then you do inflate the prices for other things like food and housing and things like that. Does that worry you, or do you think there are ways to deal with that?
Well, I think first let's lay out the argument as to why it might do that. The argument why it might do that is because it might be harder to find, let's say, day laborers to harvest in the fields. So historically, I think that might have been correct. So I think if you had tried to do this in, let's say, the 70s, I think that probably would have been correct, where we were very much labor constrained. But if you look at what's possible with automation today, it's very hard to see how that would have a meaningful impact on the cost structure of existing products. I do think what it has a very meaningful impact on is people's walk-away option. So why is it that people are willing to put up with jobs at, let's say, McDonald's, where they're dispatched at all odd hours of the day, don't really make enough money for anything? They're willing to put up with it because it is the only viable alternative that they have. And so I think that certain types of jobs would have to pay more. And if that means that something like a Walmart or a McDonald's can't exist in exactly their present form, I don't think that's going to turn out to make everything vastly more expensive in the end.
Right.
So would this in turn actually increase the incentives for automation at the lower end of the labor market then?
It might, but it wouldn't be a problem, which is very different from saying, let's raise minimum wage. Because if you raise minimum wage, then you are increasing the incentive for automation at the lower end, and you're not providing an alternative.
Right. And are you concerned, though, that the other big concern that's often raised is the same one that is raised with raising the minimum wage, which is potentially creating disincentives for either employment on, either from the employer side or from the employee side?
I think fundamentally this is about putting people in a position where they can choose what they want to do. And I think as the economy goes forward, we will have more and more things that are unpaid and yet people should be doing.
Right.
So we have a lot of these today. So taking care of an elderly parent is unpaid. We will have more elderly parents going forward.
Right.
Teaching your own children is unpaid. We will have more need to educate our children going forward. Cleaning up the environment is unpaid. We will have a greater need to clean up the environment. Creating free online courseware is unpaid. We have more of a need to do this. So one thing that I think gets confused a lot here is that people say, oh, we will always think of new things to do. Absolutely, we will always think of new things to do. That's not the question. The question isn't, are humans creative and will find new and interesting things to do? The question is, will they get paid for those new and interesting things? And one has to clearly separate those two questions. And what determines whether or not you can get paid for something is the question of what's the next best alternative to you doing that. And as long as the next best alternative to you doing that is maybe somebody somewhere else in the world doing it who is in a more desperate situation, or a machine doing it at a much lower cost, that is what's going to dictate the amount of wage that you will be able to obtain for that.
Do you think that that you need to have a certain level of automation in place already for it to work? I know, we said it may increase the incentives for automating at the low end, but is there a sort of a, I'm kind of picturing this spectrum in terms of, where you can do that. Do you think you could do that shift today, or do you think there needs to be greater automation first?
I definitely think we could do it today. I think that the statistics show that we have reached that level already. One of my favorite graphs is a graph that shows GDP versus wage. And what that graph shows is that we've had GDP growth for the last 15 plus years, but we've had it without wage growth. So I think we've already reached that turning point, at least in the developed countries.
How much... there's this other argument, and this is maybe just sort of more of a social argument. There are people who believe that people's identities are sort of so tied up in their job and in their profession. How much of a social shift do you think that this creates?
I think it's a fundamental rethinking, and it's not something we could absorb as a society overnight without a lot of discussion. We've grown up to think of ourselves and our value through the jobs that we do. It's one of the reasons why we have this strange scenario where a lot of people are working ever harder, even though we've made all this productivity progress. So we have this sort of bifurcation where some people are working crazy long hours because we've so much started to define ourselves through the things we do, through the work that we do, and we've sort of lost track of what you said earlier of leisure. There's a wonderful book I just finished reading called How Much Is Enough by Robert and Edward Sadelsky, which sort of traces the history of thinking of the question of what is the good life and what does it mean to lead a good life, and where did we sort of suddenly determine that leading a good life means that even your leisure needs to be conducted with as much equipment as possible and as quickly as possible.
Right.
And that's a really important, I think...
productivity and leisure seems
absolutely. And so the thing that fascinates me personally is to draw an even longer arc of human history, which is prior to agriculture, we were hunter-gatherers. And there are a few hunter-gatherer societies left around today. A friend of mine, Josh Furr, is studying the Pygmies, who still are what's called an immediate return hunter-gatherer society. Immediate return means they don't really engage in any kind of storage. And what's interesting is that they live in sort of a state of abundance because they work 3 hours a day and the rest of the time they have fun to goof off. What I believe is that we have it within our means to kind of return to that type of state. What intervened were thousands of years of agriculture and industry that were dominated by scarcity. And so much of our thinking is dominated by this kind of scarcity thinking that it's very hard for us as individuals or a society to embrace the fact that we might actually be able to re-enter a state of abundance. It seems so foreign to us as a concept. And I think it's really important for each individual to ask themselves this question. This is not just a social question. The question of what is enough and could I live a life of abundance today, I think is highly relevant to many of us working in tech. I think it's an important personal question. Yeah,
I think it's interesting, right? Because, you look back at, people like Keynes, predicted, right, that people would be living a life of much more leisure because of greater and greater productivity, and that's not the way it turned out. So, one of the things that really sort of has struck me about this concept of the basic income guarantee is that it effectively, it does kind of, it forces you to shift your thinking on these things. Whereas, the way that we are today, so much of it is definitely just driven by this idea of, ever increasing productivity, which often means, just more and more work, even when you can do more, get more done in a short amount of time, thanks to technology. So it's really interesting to me that beyond just, a change in the way that the society functions, it does sort of force a change in the way that we look at the way society works and the way jobs work and all of that,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So because when there are these sort of big ideas, one of the issues for me is that it's always, those things sound great in theory, but there's so much history that, how do you get to that point? Whereas this is one that, it seems like you can see a path to it actually working, because the change itself shifts the way people think about things in a way that benefits the idea itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many things about our society that are built around distributing goods based on a scarce economy.
Yeah.
That like we're just not used to thinking of like what would happen, like if things are truly abundant. And for me, one of the biggest, like the easiest ways I was able to kind of comprehend what we're moving towards is actually looking towards science fiction. And
Sure.
Gene Roddenberry did a great job in Star Trek, where imagine you had essentially a machine that I think it was, you can make anything you wanted in infinite quantities. And at
Right.
that point, like what does society look like when you don't need even currency or money to distribute scarce goods when everything is abundant?
Yeah, and that's to some extent, that's been what we've talked about on Tech Dirt for 15 years or more, which is what started out as very much focused on digital files, right? Because that was the thing that happened first, and mainly music initially. This discussion about what happens when all of a sudden those things are effectively infinite. And yet they were built on a world of scarcity.
And that, to me, is the sort of critical factor here. Is it's digital technology that has brought us online already into a world of abundance. So we can already see what a world of abundance looks like online. And now what's happening is that we're slowly using this to what we can do with bits to influence what we can do with atoms. The Keynes essay is called The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And in the Sadelsky book, there's an interesting chapter about kind of what went wrong. And what they do, which is I think very interesting, is they draw a differentiation between needs and wants. And that we have come to conflate needs and wants, and that we're defining everything in wants, and that we have a circular definition. Well, if people are buying it, that means they want it, that means it must be
Right.
good for them. And that becomes entirely circular. And that's why I have many people that I know who've made extraordinary amounts of money in tech and still are not happy and still don't seem satisfied and still want more because we've created this sort of self-referential culture of more.
Yeah. And the Sadelsky stuff is really interesting. I actually just heard a podcast with one of them, I forget which one, discussing the book, and I think it was that book, and some of these ideas, and but when I was listening to him talk about it, I felt like at least the way he described it, and I haven't read the book. It felt like he was sort of, swimming against the tide almost, and sort of hoping for changes that I wasn't quite sure how they could possibly happen.
I just finished it on vacation, and I'm planning to write a little review of it. I don't agree with all of the book, but I do agree with this basic notion that we have started to confuse needs and wants, and that part of what basic income guarantee is about is to try and refocus people on needs and on what they can do in the lives they can live when their basic needs are met. And I believe that there are a great many people who would lead different lives if this were available, and that many good things for humanity would come out of people leading different lives, working on things that they were fundamentally excited about, as opposed to just figuring out how they're going to pay the next rent check or how they're going to pay the next for the next meal.
And so do you think, and I think you had mentioned this in the TEDx presentation that you did, does it, one of the ideas is to sort of, find a space where we could test this out, a city, a small country, or, an area.
And that's what's happening. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting new experiments being run, most of them in developing countries where a relatively small amount per day basically constitutes a basic income for somebody. And a lot of that work has not yet been published, but the results look very promising.
Yeah, I mean, it would definitely be interesting to see. I mean, there have been other studies too about, because if you go back to sort of the classical view of economics, which often is wrong, very much based on scarcity. This idea that if you pay people more, that you'll get more productivity out of them tends not to be true. The classical view is that if you pay them more, you'll get more productivity. And then what the studies have shown, and a whole bunch of them now at this point, have shown that doesn't actually work out. That sort of once people hit a certain level, which I guess to them it's not the basic income, but it's what they sort of feel comfortable at, then their productivity just does begin to drop off. I almost wonder if how do you, if there are ways to handle that, right? I mean, so basic income guarantee is sort of just hits at a certain flat level across the board.
A question that people often bring up is they say, well, how can you pay everybody the same? Some people live in New York, some people live in Detroit. I think a big part of this is that if you wanted to move to Detroit today and you lived in New York, you really couldn't unless you already have a job lined up when you get there, or you have accumulated wealth that lets you do that. Most people are in neither camp. And so we're creating these sort of self-proliferating circles where people live in an area and they can't actually go to an area that would be cheaper. And that kind of rebalancing could occur much more naturally under a system of basic income. One other objection that people do bring up is this whole idea that, people really won't know what to do with themselves, and as a result, they'll resort to drugs and alcohol. And I definitely think that we will need to educate people what it means and how to live, and what all the things are they could work on. Without a doubt, we have educated people for a very long time to the exact opposite, which is you have to find a job and you have to develop exactly these skills, and this is legitimate, and that's the only way to earn a living. And what's interesting, though, is that a lot of these sort of research projects that have been run, they produce data that shows that people tend to not suddenly go and say, okay, now I'm just going to be drunk every day.
I mean, I think, I don't know. I mean, I think there's so many different things that can be done with free time today that, that don't involve alcohol and drugs. I mean, I would love to have more free time.
No, it's right. Except that what's interesting today is that the people who do have jobs, they tend to spend their leisure mostly on just lean back consumption. And very little of it is the kind of leisure that I think people had in mind historically when they thought about more leisure, which is activities like gardening or any kind of activity that, in fact, requires a certain skill that you need to first develop. For instance, I love sailing. It takes a lot of skill to sail a boat. It's a wonderful leisure activity, but it's a very different leisure activity from just sitting back and watching television.
Sure.
Right. So it's not just time, but also energy that we're spending in work that we can then spend in leisure as well.
Exactly.
So,
and a lot of that energy will also be spent on, as I said earlier, on the kind of activities that we really need more of.
right.
Well, so what do you mean by that?
Meaning, things like parenting, or things like taking care of people who are sick, or cleaning up the environment, or creating high quality educational content, things that are unpaid and will continue to be unpaid, but that people would like to do. They would like to be able to be in a position to work on them instead of...
So it's kind of interesting, because for this to work, the other sort of mindset shift that's needed is to recognize that, and there are a lot of other reasons to do this, but to get past the concept of thinking about things like GDP and
there are a couple of big things I think you need to get past. One is you need to get past GDP as sort of the measure of the economy.
Right.
That's number one. And we need to get past GDP as the measure of the economy because we're making stuff free. And so tracking it via GDP is completely useless.
Right.
The other thing you need to get past, though, I think, is a certain amount of distributional anxiety. So this whole idea, well, why should this person get any money? What have they done to deserve this? Which I think is very deeply ingrained sort of in the American psyche, more so than in the European psyche, which is this idea, well, why should this person be getting any money? The funny irony here is that the one state in the U.S. that has this is Alaska, right? And they have it because of the oil fund. So it's slightly ironic because we associate that with being a sort of a conservative state,
right?
But I do think that's an anxiety that people have, is sort of this idea, well, why should my taxes, if I'm making a lot of money, go and support everybody else? Now, the reality is that's already how it works today. It's just cloaked. So I pay taxes today, and then we have a food stamp program, and we have public housing, and we have all sorts of other things. Most of these programs have all sorts of inefficiencies, allocational inefficiencies that they introduce. And so what's interesting about this idea, in my mind, is that it could appeal once people kind of get over the hump of saying, okay, this is redistributional, yes. Once people get over that hump, it could have a very broad appeal.
Right. Do you worry about it acting as potentially a disincentive? I mean, right, so you invest in startups that are doing innovative things. Do you worry that this scares off entrepreneurs or innovators away from building the next big thing?
In what way?
Just because, they can now go and spend more time educating or taking care of a parent or
yeah, I mean,
along those lines.
I think very few people who start companies start them exclusively because they think it's a way to really make a lot of money. Most people who start companies do it because there's something that they have kind of a burning desire to see exist in the world. They set out to find a particular product and found the existing products wanting, and so they want to create a better version of it.
Right.
So I'm not at all worried that suddenly somehow we'll all turn into slackers and we'll all just be lying on the beach drinking pina coladas. I think there are tons of people who are intrinsically motivated to want to create something. And on top of that, in this world that we envision with the basic income, you still can have a Mark Zuckerberg or nothing says that you can't make a lot of money by creating a company.
And there's actually, the counter argument to my own argument is, that it also is much less risk for those people, right? So the person who has a great idea doesn't have to worry about leaving their job and having no income or having to first raise money from people like you before they can go.
Which I think will importantly vastly increase the pool of people who can start companies. I think it's easy to forget that a lot of people who start companies today come from relatively well-off families where they can take that risk of not finding a job. One other thing that we hadn't talked about before is, one other area where having a walkaway option is really important is in sort of family relationships. So, women or men who suffer from domestic abuse, mostly women, often can't leave because they're not the breadwinner. And so if they were to leave, they would not be, they would be in a terrible economic situation. So I think the sort of aspect of how much more liberty this creates for individuals to live the lives they want to live and to work on the things they want to work on, including on startups, I think is super important and I believe would unleash a lot of new innovation and a lot of new interesting things that would get created.
Yeah. And I think that's why, to some extent, as I mentioned in the opening, like, when I the very first time I heard about this idea, I thought it was the kind of thing that, on the libertarian side, people would hate. And yet I'm seeing lots of libertarian folks who are really, warming to the idea quite a bit. And I find that really interesting because, I think their sort of natural inclination is certainly to be against, redistribution, but they're recognizing that it does create, more freedom, which is something that they tend to.
It's in the name.
Yes. And so it's, it's one of those ideas that strikes me as really interesting. I do, I mean, how much political feasibility do you think there is, or?
I think these are the kind of ideas, like other really big ideas, let's say democracy, that I don't think you can assume are going to happen very quickly. We took a lot of wrong turns along the way to get to properly working democracies, and
I don't even
arguably
know if we're there yet.
and arguably we have introduced a new set of problems. So, but what I like about ideas is that once they are in the world and once people start batting them around, even if they get shut down for a while, they have this tendency to come back. And the basic income guarantee is one of those examples. It's an idea that has been around for several decades, as far back as the 60s. So I'm under no illusion that we're going to get this tomorrow, but I think the fact that more attention is being paid to it, not just in the U.S., but lots of countries around the world, where in some European countries, some of the Green parties have put this on their official party program. There's a referendum in Switzerland. There's just a lot of activity. And again, it may not happen this time around, but you need these kind of explorations to eventually have a big idea become a reality. Yeah,
and I think it would be interesting too, because with, as with anything, right? I mean, as in the world of startups and innovation, you'll see a lot of experiments, and people will adapt and adjust and innovate based on the real world results of how those work. And I think it only becomes a more interesting idea over time. And so it's something that I think is definitely really compelling, and certainly worth thinking about. And figuring out how it would work. I'm still, I still wonder about some of the consequences of how it works out. But the more I think about it, the more sort of deeply ingrained it keeps digging into my brain as something that, wait, this really could make sense.
Yeah, it's a very powerful idea of a different way of organizing how the economy works.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're gonna wrap up. And normally, what we do is, if you have any final thoughts, something to leave our listeners with on this particular idea, I don't know if you.
Yeah, I think just ask yourself what you would do in your life if you didn't have to work to meet your basic needs.
Yeah, and think about how that changes so many other things, and potentially in really powerful ways. I think it's really interesting. I think it's something that we should I think a lot of people should be thinking about, and I know that I'm certainly going to be thinking about a lot more, and I know that I'm going to have a lot more questions on it. So I think maybe we'll have you back again.
That would be great. In fact, I'm going back to New York to attend the North American Basic Income Congress.
Ah, excellent. So excellent timing. And then we'll keep this conversation going, because I think there's some really interesting ideas here that are absolutely worth exploring. So thanks for joining us.
No, my pleasure.
Very, very interesting conversation. And we will be back next week on the Tech Dirt Podcast.
It's been said that the first casualty of war is truth. And I'm inclined to agree. Listen, we live in an age of instant information. So isn't it strange that things have been hidden away from us? Governments think we need to gain their trust, but it's the other way around. Just take a look. Nothing tells us more than raw data does. So it's important it's all available to us. Plus, put up for debate and looked at by the public's gaze, because there's a lot more.